by contributing to the John Lothian News GoFundMe campaign to support the Markets Wiki education history-focused video series, and more.
My mother wanted me to be a dentist because her father was an oral surgeon. She stressed that to my brother and I, that was a very good profession, consistent income, and that's what she wanted us to be. I wanted to be a baseball player. I played a lot of Little League when I was a kid, and then played in high school. Turns out I wasn't good enough to be a professional baseball player, and changed my goals when I got into college at Cal, and wanted to be an economic development specialist. And I went to University of California, Berkeley, and then I went to MIT for my PhD program. Actually got a master's in economics. Kind of that was my goal at that point in time. When I got out, it was funny. It was 1970. I was recruited to work at the White House Conference on Youth, working for one of President Nixon's deputies, Bob Finch from California. And we held a 1,500-person youth conference in the middle of the Vietnam War. It was supposed to be in D.C., but the president didn't like the idea of 1,500 youth descending on D.C. in 1971. And we had that conference in Estes Park, Colorado. And that's a whole different, that experience was pretty amazing. But I met enough of President Nixon's associates to know that I never wanted to be associated with him again. And I moved back to San Francisco and started a management consulting career. My brother always loved to trade, and he became an options market maker on the Pacific in 1976. And when I compared my income as a management consultant with his as a trader, I was earning about 10% of what he was earning. And so I asked him whether we could become partners, and he trained me to become a market maker on the floor of the Pacific in 1977. It was interesting. You didn't have the top, you didn't have IBM, you didn't have General Motors, you didn't have the top issues to trade. And therefore the paper was pretty inconsistent. And so it attracted more of the theoretical guys. And so you made money two ways. One, you made money because you understood theoreticals and you could put on spreads. And in fact, some of the top theoretical traders at that time were originally market makers on the floor of the Pacific. Blair Hull, for example, started at the Pacific Stock Exchange. Irv Kessler started at the Pacific Stock Exchange. And a lot of them moved back to Chicago because they could earn a lot more money there. But they fine-tuned their trading ability, and it was all in the theoretical space. It wasn't, day trading paper that would be coming in consistently because we didn't have that kind of flow. And I think that's pretty much how people survived making markets. Different exchanges kind of decided they were going to violate the unwritten rule that you couldn't list somebody else's issue, and it was insane because the big firms, the order flow firms, decided they were going to send their paper to the exchange that had the most volume. Well, you can imagine market makers had interest in generating volume. And so there was a huge surge in market maker to market maker volume on every exchange. The SEC didn't really like that. They actually cited some Pacific market makers and other market makers and other exchanges for wash trading. But eventually, I think with the guidance of informal guidance of the SEC, the exchanges decided they weren't going to do that anymore. They were going to go back to respecting the one issue per exchange philosophy, which lasted for quite a while until we started to list NASDAQ stocks. And that's when multiple listing started in kind of the late 80s. When multiple listing took off, it didn't really affect the Pacific that much because, as I say, we had the lower tier stocks. And so it just gave us access to, the IBMs of the world, which we were already trading. A lot of the market makers on the floor, while they were on the floor, they were sending orders to the Amex and the Philex and the SIBO. And in fact, in the early days, again, being a theoretical guy, you could make a lot of money sending orders, for example, to the Amex, because the original setup for the Amex was that specialists specialized not in a class, they specialized in a series. So you had one guy, maybe trading the IBM 100 calls, and then another specialist would be trading the IBM 90 calls. They never talked to each other. And so if you were a theoretical trader, you could compare the theoreticals and you'd buy from one and sell to the other because they were looking at a different way of setting the markets. When we started, the opening in New York was at 10 a.m., which was 7 a.m. San Francisco time. Then they moved it to 6:30. And then there was discussions about moving it earlier, which, had 300 market makers going in agony. The problem was that as opposed to being in Chicago, where the starting time was 9, if you wanted to get up and check your positions and then make it into the floor, you had to be up at 4 a.m. And so it was, your entire lifestyle had to change. You'd go to bed at 8:30 and get up at 4 a.m. Now, the big advantage of that was if you play golf, you could go out and play golf at 1:30 and get a full round in. But the challenges were mostly time zone and trying to manage your positions and being ready for trading, and particularly commuting in. If you didn't live in San Francisco, commuting into the floor, could take you a half an hour to an hour. Well, the Pacific Stock Exchange used to be the LA Stock Exchange and the San Francisco Stock Exchange, and they merged in the 50s. The dominant players on the stock exchange were out of LA. Ed Wedbush was the chairman of the exchange. Wedbush Securities was big. And in the late 70s, volumes were not that robust on the equity side. They decided that they wanted to merge the two floors into one floor and save money. What they forgot was they just opened an options exchange with 300 traders. And the option traders were not in LA, they were in San Francisco, and they didn't want to move. So we had a big fight. I organized a group called the Pacific Association of Market Makers, and then went around and gathered proxies twice to vote down the merger, which made me pretty unpopular with the powers that be at the exchange. But we voted it down twice, and so there were separate floors for another decade. But the traders didn't have to move. But it was mostly economics on the equity side. And it's one of those problems where you have equity exchange and an options exchange together. The interests don't always align. I was not very popular among the equity members for having led the fight to not merge the exchanges. And then we needed to have a new floor. We were growing. Our floor was in an office building lobby next door to the equity exchange. And we were just bursting out of that area. And so we needed to build a new floor. And that was very expensive. And the equity members weren't sure they really wanted to pay for that. And so we had some interesting discussions about how that money was going to be raised and who was going to pay for it. Slowly, I was on the board. I was on the board for 6 years. I was vice chairman for one, and I was acting chairman for another year. The equity members began to realize that the options floor was a really good profit center. And slowly we got other option members on the board, and the attitude kind of shifted more into the options members' power and influence at the board. But the biggest challenge was being accepted and fighting for the money that the options floor needed to expand. We built it actually on the floor upstairs. We took an entire floor of the office building, had really high ceilings. Took us about 3 years to actually build that. Well, my brother and I created Sage Clearing. We're the only local clearing firm back in 1980. We started in 80, we went operational 82. And so we were running the clearing firm. We had about 40 or 50 market makers. I was a market maker on the floor. That day was one of the scariest days in my life, where I'd say 90% of the market makers stopped making markets because nobody was sure that any clearing firm was going to survive, that the industry was going to survive, and they just stopped. So there were tremendous opportunities to make money. Yet at the same time, our clearing firm did pretty well. We had one person that lost money, but because we had a real-time risk system, we had moved clients out of the, we told market makers to close positions the day before, but we had a settlement issue. And so we had to work on a settlement issue because at that time, you could have been hedged short puts, but as stocks moved down, some of them as much as 50%, you ended up being long stock and long other puts, but you couldn't settle the stock because you couldn't borrow the money against your long option positions. We had to scramble pretty hard to make settlement, but it was a very stressful time, both trying to manage your positions on the floor and then trying to manage your clearing firm upstairs, and then trying to convince all the other market makers that things were going to be all right, even though you didn't know whether they were going to be all right or not. It certainly was a crazy time. The earthquake was on a Tuesday. I know, because I was at the World Series when the earthquake hit. And the next morning, they closed our building because they had to examine it. Ours is it was a 30s building that the exchanges were in. And they closed the building so we couldn't operate. Plus, we didn't have any electricity. At least I know about our experience at Sage. My brother and I drove our cars down and parked in front of the building where people would have to go into the floor. And we took stock orders. Nobody could trade options. Remember, there was no multiple listing then. So you couldn't, I was trading Hilton hotels. I had a huge position. I had to dynamically hedge with equities. And so we were on the phone to our partner, Chicago Corporation in Chicago, and we were doing equity trades on the phone. And, I have a picture. There's a line of market makers outside my car and my brother's car wanting to put orders in, trying to track what was happening in the markets. It was one of the greatest moments, and nobody's ever written about this, the greatest moments in the history of the options markets was when all the exchanges agreed to take our issues and list them on their exchanges, which is what their first offer was. And we said, well, once they're listed on your exchanges, we'll never get them back. So we flew our market makers out on Wednesday morning. Actually, it was Wednesday night. Sorry. Took us a while to figure this out. And we stopped in Chicago, Philadelphia, and New York and dropped off, a split of 200, oboes and floor brokers and market makers. And the exchanges actually put up pits that were Pacific Stock Exchange pits. And you were able to make markets for half a day on Thursday and on Friday to try and adjust your positions. I mean, it was a massive effort. The New York Stock Exchange overnight built, I think, 4 posts with new screens, with everything set up. I mean, that's where I was. I led the group to the New York Stock Exchange. It was an incredible effort, and I think it helped save the Pacific Stock Exchange. I think it helped save the industry. It showed the common interest of the exchanges and our community in supporting the business. Now, it wasn't without its issues. This is a trading ticket I've got encapsulated in lucite. So on the Pacific, a red was a sell and a black was a buy. On the New York, it was exactly the opposite. So at the end of the first day, the New York came to me and said, we have 98% out trades. And it's because the guys thought they were buying and they were actually selling the tickets. So the New York spent all night correcting that so the positions be right Friday morning. I mean, it's pretty hard to believe, but it was an amazing, amazing story.
John Lothian News would like to thank those individuals who have contributed to our Markets Wiki Education GoFundMe campaign. Their financial assistance allows us to produce and distribute videos like this for our Open Outcry Traders History Project or the Path to Electronic Trading video series. Join them in supporting John Lothian News, capturing the history of our industry.